Thank you so much for this presentation, and thank you all for coming. And I want first to apologize for postponing the lecture. My plane was cancelled, that's why I had to do this. And I also want to apologize for reading the text because my English is quite poor. That's why I will read. Maybe you will understand me better then. Okay, let's start. Okay. As many people know, the Bodhisattva became Buddha by following the so-called middle path. This path involves rejecting two extremes, indulging in one's desires on one hand and self-mortification on the other. However, to recognize the futility of harsh self-torment and discover the new principle, he had to endure 6 years of severe austerity. In Buddhist canonical texts, the Bodhisattva's ascetic practices are described in vivid and elaborate detail. Primarily, they involved strict food restrictions and breath control. Yet some scriptures also mention that Śākyamuni had to courageously endure humiliation from people who happened to come across him in his forest retreat. Buddhist texts illustrate this with a brief episode that captures the reader's attention and in many ways seems unusual. Different sources describe this episode in varying ways, but in its most common version, it can be summarized as follows. Shepherds or shepherds' children come across the Bodhisattva in the forest. Siddhārtha is emaciated from severe fasting, gaunt and deep in meditation. Seeing him in such a state, they mistake him for a goblin and begin to amuse themselves by tormenting him, throwing dust or gravel at him, and stuffing clumps of grass into his nostrils and ears. Siddhārtha endures it all without reacting in any way. End of story. More than 14 variations of this plot can be found in Buddhist canonical literature. In this lecture, I don't have the opportunity to cover all versions, but most of the existing variants can be grouped into several traditions. The first tradition can be referred to as the Pali tradition. The oldest known version of the story in question is presented in the Mahāsihanada Sutta from the Pali canon. Here is the relevant fragment from Horner's translation. Quote, "Then I, Sariputta, lay down to sleep on a cremation ground, leaning on a skeleton. Cowherds' boys, having come up to me, spat and staled on me and showered me with dust and stuck twigs into my ears. But I, Sariputta, well know that I was not the creator of a malign heart against them. This then came to be for me, Sariputta, through abiding in even-mindedness." Unquote. Sorry, can I move this? Okay. The Mahāsihanada Sutta has also come down to us in a Chinese translation made in 1023. However, in this version of the sutra, the episode in question was greatly altered. Apparently, the story of the shepherd's children presented the Bodhisattva in an unfavorable light, and for this reason the story was subjected to a process called rationalization in classical philology. So the Chinese text reports only that the people crowded around the Bodhisattva full of curiosity, and the Bodhisattva did not respond to them. That is all. Similar processes seem to be reflected in later Pali texts, such as the Chariya Pitaka and the Nidana Katha, which post-date the Sinhanada Sutta. Both texts contain the episode in question, though they do not speak of Siddhārtha, but of one of his past lives, when he was an Ajivika ascetic named Lomahamsa. The effect of self-censorship is evident here in the absence of the list of offensive acts committed by the shepherd's children towards Bodhisattva. In both texts, the episode consists of a verse stating that the children were drawn to the Bodhisattva's appearance as he practiced asceticism in the cremation ground, and a brief prose passage noting that the Bodhisattva remained equanimous towards both those who mocked him and those who honored him. Since both the later Pali texts and the Chinese translation of the Mahāsīhanāda Sutta have preserved the episode in question in a substantially revised censored form, they should be disregarded when analyzing different versions of the narrative. Only the version found in the Pali Mahāsīhanāda Sutta should be taken into account. And also, since I mentioned versions of the narrative that underwent rationalization, I should add to them the one presented in the Sutra of the collection of the Buddha's past deeds, a Buddha's biography that survived only in the 6th century Chinese translation. It will also not be taken into account. Now let's turn to the tradition of the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya. It should be examined second if we follow chronological order. The Skandhaka of this Vinaya concludes with the Sankhya-Bhedavastu section, which includes, among the other things, an account of the Buddha's life. Here, the account of insults towards the Bodhisattva generally matches the version presented in the Mahāsīhanāda Sutta. I think I don't need to read all the quotation here. Two elements distinguish this version of the story from the one presented in the Mahāsīhanāda Sutta. First, the characters. Here it is not cowherd boys, but village boys and girls who act. Second, and more importantly, among their actions appear a new detail. While stuffing bunches of grass into Bodhisattva's ear and pulling them out, they call Gautama a dusty piśāca. A piśāca is a type of goblin, a flesh-eater, including human flesh, known for its vile behavior and ugly appearance. They resemble Rakshasas and are often mentioned alongside them, though they are of a lower nature. Here are they. The early 8th century Chinese translation of the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya presents a later version of the narrative under discussion. The actors in it are village men and women. In this version of the story, the element involving the piśāca and the grass tufts evolves into a self-contained mini-narrative. Quote, they took in heads stalks of grass and inserted them into the ear openings of the Bodhisattva, and those stalks stuck out left and right. Thus they laughed at him, went away, came again, and pulled out stalks from the ears and then spoke to the Bodhisattva in the ear. We see a dusty demon. Again and again, many times they repeated, dusty demon, unquote. Particularly noteworthy in this version is the introduction of an additional element, the mockery of the Bodhisattva. They laughed at him. A very rich source of material for attempting to trace the evolution of this narrative within the tradition of a single text is provided by the Lalita Vistara. It is perhaps the most well-known biography of the Buddha. This text has come down to us in a Sanskrit version as well as in 2 Chinese and 1 Tibetan translation. The Tibetan translation is very close to the extant Sanskrit version and therefore will not be examined separately here. For the same reason, I haven't analyzed the Tibetan translation of the Sankhya-Bhedavastu. As for the Chinese translations of the Lalita Vistara, they date from different periods and both differ significantly from the Sanskrit text available to us. The translation by Fahu was completed in the 4th century, that by Divakara in the 7th century, while the Sanskrit text most likely dates to the 9th century. Each of the 3 versions narrates the story of the insults against the Bodhisattva differently, and in each of them the episode is preserved twice, first in prose and then in verse, with the prose and poetic versions differing from one another in all the 3 cases. Thus we have 6 different variants of the narrative in question, along with an approximate relative dating on the 3 versions of the Lalita Vistara. Often, such abundance of data allows us to at least roughly understand how a particular episode from the Buddha's life changed over the centuries. However, in the case of this particular narrative, it doesn't work. It is impossible to determine how the episode in question evolved within the Lalita Vistara tradition. Now I will illustrate how an episode is presented in the prose part of the Sanskrit version of the sutra. I will not describe all 6 versions of the story so as not to take up too much time. In the Sanskrit version of the Lalita Vistara, the passage we are interested in is divided into two parts. The first part lists the characters who mocked the Bodhisattva: village boys, village girls, cowherds, cattle herders, grass carriers, wood carriers, or cow dung carriers. It is mentioned that they mistook him for a dusty piśāca, played with him, and smeared him with dust. There is no information about the location where this took place or about Gautama's reaction to these actions. The subsequent passage describes how grass was stuffed into his ears, and not just his ears, but also his nose and mouth. However, this is represented not as an account of the villager's actions, but rather as a depiction of his body emaciated due to ascetic practices. Quote, "Then during those 6 years, the Bodhisattva's body became so extremely crippled and weak that when they put a bunch of grass into his ear holes, it came out of his nostrils. And when they put it into his nostrils, it came out of his ear holes, and so forth." Among the other versions of this episode found in the Lalita Vistara tradition, the only significantly different one is the prose fragment from the Fahus translation. However, Fahus' version does not resemble any other, and therefore I do not consider it to derive from any ancient variant of the story. To conclude this brief overview of several surviving versions of the narrative, let me turn to the Chinese text, the Bodhisattva Womb Sutra. This work is a translation of a no longer extant Indian original produced between the late 4th and the early 5th centuries. Its account of the mistreatment of the Bodhisattva contains a unique element not found in other versions, one that nevertheless significant. The account of the villagers' mistreatment in this text is combined with the narrative of other ascetic feats of Gautama. At the junction of these two episodes appears an element not found in other accounts of the Bodhisattva's asceticism, yet one that represents a variation on a very common motif in ancient descriptions of forest hermits. I refer to this motif as envelopment by nature. Here's how this appears in the sutra text. I ate one hemp seed and 1 grain of rice a day. Blue pigeons and sparrows laid eggs on my head. Poisonous snakes laying cinnabar-colored eggs coiled around my body. Shepherds and hunters threw stones and potsherds. Sometimes they stabbed and maimed my body. Sometimes they poked a stick into my stomach and it reached my back. End of quote. Here the Bodhisattva is depicted as a classic forest ascetic, one who remains motionless for so long that nature gradually begins to reclaim his body. The most frequent cited example of such kind of process is the termite mound that slowly forms around the hermit's rigid body, eventually covering it almost entirely. This happened with the legendary rishis Cyavana and Valmiki. Here is Valmiki depicted. Alongside the termite mound, snakes are often mentioned. They inhabit in the mound and thus remain perpetually near the ascetic, as in the cases of the giant Tirthankara Bahubali or the Brahmin Pippalada. In the case of the ascetic Jajali, sparrows even built nests in his hair, laying eggs that hatched into fledglings. It remains unclear which part of this sutra passage the envelopment by nature motive belongs to the account of the Bodhisattva's austerities or the episode involving the villagers. Regardless, even though this motif does not appear in other Buddha's biographies, I ask you to take note of it, as it will reappear later in our analysis of certain non-Buddhist parallels to the narrative under examination. Oh, I move it here. Although more than 14 versions of the story about the insults directed at the Bodhisattva have come down to us, it seems to me that it is impossible to determine with certainty which of these versions is the oldest. The oldest text in which this story appears should certainly be considered the Mahāsihanada Sutta, But we have no guarantee that some later text did not preserve an older version of the episode. There are several reasons that make it difficult to identify the oldest version of the story. First, it is difficult to date texts under consideration with any precision, a common issue in ancient and medieval Indian literature. Second, even when we can roughly determine the time a text was composed, non-authorial Indian works, especially religious texts, are almost always multi-layered. They were compiled over many centuries and thus may contain both ancient and later textual strata. In such cases, it is not always possible to determine which layer a particular passage belongs to. Third, the situation is further complicated by the fact that a significant portion of the available sources consists of Chinese translations of now lost Indian texts, about which we have very little information. Even if a translation dates to a later period, this does not guarantee that the original text was not from a much earlier era. Finally, the very nature of the story seems to make it highly susceptible to modification. The compilers and transmitters of Buddhist canonical texts appear to have struggled with the idea that the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, was mocked and humiliated by villagers, including children. As a result, they likely sought to censor or alter the narrative. Nevertheless, it makes sense to attempt to outline a sort of median version of the story, which can then serve as a kind of basis for seeking parallels outside the Buddhist tradition. To achieve this, I have compiled a summary table in which the data from each relevant version of the story is organized into the following columns: the venue, the characters who direct actions toward the Bodhisattva, the actions themselves, the words they spoke or the thoughts that arose in their minds, and finally, their attitude toward the events. Here is how this table looks like. I will not analyze it now in detail because it will take much time, of course. We can assume that if the same element appears multiple times in this table, there is a high probability that it originates from some ancient version of the plot. Out of such elements, the following average plot can be constructed. The Bodhisattva remained in the cremation ground, emaciated from his severe austerities. Children from a nearby village would come to him, laugh at him, throw dust and dirt at him, stick twigs or grass into his ears, and call him piśāca. Yet Siddhārtha endured all these torments with unwavering fortitude. Now, keeping this story in mind, let us briefly turn to the visual material. This narrative has indeed found its reflection in Buddhist visual art. To the best of my knowledge, it was Dominik Wujastik who first drew attention to this in his article in 1984. Currently, my Moscow-based colleague Alexander Babin is conducting a thorough study of the origin and dissemination of images related to this story. Together, we hope to publish a joint article on the subject. I am grateful to him for the materials he shared with me for this lecture. It is not difficult to guess which iconographic motif embodies the story of the Bodhisattva's torment. Naturally, it is the figure standing on the other side of Siddhārtha inserting sticks into his ears. The oldest such depiction is found in a fresco from cave number 16 at Ajanta. Here the Bodhisattva is depicted in a meditative posture in the center. To his left and right, men are standing and inserting some kind of sticks into his ears. This image forms part of a series of depictions illustrating the story of the Buddha's enlightenment. The cows on the left The cows on the left may either signify the involvement of villagers in the narrative, or they might be associated with the Ajanta scene to the left, showing Sujata preparing a milk-based rice porridge, odana, for Siddhārtha. Later, all depictions of this scene showing villagers tormenting the Bodhisattva will follow the same general composition. The Bodhisattva meditates at the center, flanked by two villagers inserting sticks or grass stems into his ears. In most cases, such representation will form part of a larger visual narrative cycle depicting the Buddha's enlightenment. However, while the Ajanta fresco dates to the 5th century CE, all other known examples of this scene belong to a much later period, the 11th to 14th centuries. Here are 11th century reliefs from Myanmar. The structure of the images here is roughly the same. Here is a similar 11th century image above a temple doorway in Gari, in the Tibet Autonomous Region of China. It's unclear, however, who the people flanking the Bodhisattva are or what they are doing, but it is obvious that they are doing something with his ears, and that the Bodhisattva is depicted emaciated from fasting. Here is a fragment of an 11th century manuscript cover from Bihar. And here is an image depicted on the dhoti of a 13th century Maitreya statue from the Alchi monastic complex in Ladakh. Alexander Babin managed to find a fairly large number of such images. In most cases, these depictions form part of a larger visual narrative recounting the story of the Buddha's enlightenment. Nearly all of them date back to the period between the 11th and 14th century CE. Their geographical distribution is quite extensive. They have been found across regions spanning from Kashmir and western Tibet to Myanmar. As I mentioned earlier, the story of the Bodhisattva's torment is depicted in a standardized manner across these images. The Bodhisattva sits in a meditative posture, often emaciated from fasting, while figures on the either side insert sticks or blades of grass into his ears. Unfortunately, these visual sources do not provide any additional detail about the story itself. For my presentation, their significance lies elsewhere. They reveal a tangible connection between Buddhism's narrative of the ascetic and herdsman and a strikingly similar episode in Jain tradition. In manuscripts of the Kalpa Sutra, an ancient Jain text that includes the biography of Mahāvīra, we encounter a series of images strikingly similar to the Buddhist ones. Two figures flank Mahāvīra inserting something into his ears. The only difference is that Mahāvīra is not seated cross-legged but standing. However, this distinction should not surprise us, as in Jain tradition, Tirthankarans performing ascetic practices are often depicted in a standing posture. Some manuscripts include a caption next to the image stating that it depicts an upasarga, that is, the series of hardships Mahāvīra endured while practicing asceticism. However, although illustrations of people inserting sticks into Mahāvīra's ears adorn the manuscript of the Kalpa Sutra, this episode does not actually appear in the Kalpa Sutra itself. The textual description of Mahāvīra's asceticism is very brief, without much detail. In Jacobi's translation, the relevant passage reads simply, quote, "For more than 12 years, Venerable ascetic Mahāvīra neglected his body and abandoned the care of it. He with equanimity bore, underwent, and suffered all pleasant or unpleasant occurrences arising from the divine powers, men, or animals." Unquote. The text does not specify what exactly these unpleasant occurrences were. The story depicted in these illustrations is narrated in Trishashti Shalaka Purusha Charita by Hemachandra, 12th century. This text provides a much more detailed account of Mahāvīra's asceticism. While Mahāvīra stood motionless, deep in meditation, a cowherd nearby unties his bulls and went about his business. The bulls wandered off into the forest, and when the cowherd returned, he could not find them where he had left them. He then said to Mahāvīra, quote, "Noble Lord, where are my oxen? Why do you not answer, you who are called a hermit? Or do you not hear my words? It seems your ear holes are useless." Enraged by the Lord's silence, he thrust stalks of kasha grass into the master's ear holes. He inserted the stalks of kasha grass so deeply that they met each other and became as if one stalk. Then thinking, let someone pull these stakes out, the cowherd cut off the protruding ends and left. Unquote. It is evident that in this case, we are dealing with a certain typical asceticism narrative. A hermit remains motionless, a villager torments him by inserting grass stalks or sticks into his ears, and the ascetic does not react. At the very least, we can consider this a standard motif in both Buddhist and Jain traditions, and possibly even across broader shamanic traditions. It is difficult to say at this point whether this motif originates from an ancient shared shamanic tradition or whether the Jains inherited it from the Buddhists. However, based on available evidence, the latter version seems more likely, as this story appears in early Buddhist texts of the Pali canon, while in Jainism it emerges only in the late medieval period. Sorry. However, the situation becomes more complicated by the fact that we encounter this type of narrative outside the Shramanic traditions as well, specifically in Vedic literature. A similar episode appears in the myth of the Rishi Cyavana in the Shatapatha Brahmana and the Jaiminiya Brahmana. I'm grateful to Dominic Haas for bringing this story to my attention. The full story of Cyavana is quite lengthy, and I won't recount it here. The episode that interests us serves as the opening of this story. Here is the relevant passage from the Shatapatha Brahmana in Egeling's translation. It mentions that, quote, Cyavana the Angirasa was left behind here on earth, decrepit and ghost-like. But Sharyata, the Manava, just then wandered about here with his tribe and settled nearby the same place. His boys, while playing, setting the decrepit ghost-like man at naught, pelted him with clothes. In this version of the episode, the role of the Bodhisattva is taken by the decrepit Rishi Cyavana, whose appearance, much like that of Siddhārtha, is disfigured. The children of a tribe or village, grama, torment him, and it is possible that they too are the children of herdsmen, since it is the herdsmen, Gopala, Avipala, who later report to Sharyata about the children insulted the sage. The children considered the rishi worthless and, while playing, Kridantah, pelted him with clods of earth, Loshtar Vipipishuch. Even some of the words used in the Brahmana coincide with those we encounter in Buddhist scriptures. It is also worth noting that, like the Bodhisattva in certain Buddhist texts, Cyavana is compared to a demon, Kritya Rupa. However, in this case, he is not likened to a piśāca, but rather to a Kritya, a goddess personifying witchcraft and black magic. Nevertheless, both of these demonic beings are characterized by their ugly appearance. Clearly, it is precisely this feature that leads to their identification or comparison with Bodhisattva and Cyavana. An episode variant from the Jaiminiya Brahmana has some minor differences, but overall also shows significant similarities with the Buddha's narrative. Neither of the two Vedic versions of the story contains the motif of putting grass or sticks into the ears, nose, or mouth. This is strange, since in one form or another this motif is present in 9 of the 11 versions of the Buddhist episode examined, which testifies to its antiquity. But if we turn to later versions of the legend of Cyavana, we will see that this motif is present there, although in a slightly modified form. The legend of Cyavana in its later form is recounted in the Mahabharata, the Devi Bhagavata Purana, and the Bhagavata Purana. In these later versions, Cyavana is not depicted as a decrepit old man, but rather as an ascetic engaged in severe penance. Due to remaining motionless in one posture for an extremely long time, his body became covered with an anthill, leaving only his eyes visible, shining like two glowing lights. This description echoes that of the Bodhisattva in the Bodhisattva Womb Sutra, where it is said that the nature enveloped his body. birds built nests in his hair, and snakes coiled around him. However, in this version, the key figure is not the cowherd children, but Sukanya, the daughter of the tribal chieftain Śāryata. She noticed that the two glowing lights within the anthill. And, out of curiosity and foolishness, poked them with a thorn. This is the only act of humiliation inflicted upon Cyavana in the later versions of the story, and it bears a suspicious resemblance to the motive of inserting grass or sticks into the ears, nose, or mouth of the Bodhisattva. I have no doubt that the stories about the mockery of a motionless ascetic, or rishi, in the Buddhist, Jain, and Vedic traditions share a common origin. Even if we assume that a situation of such kind was typical for ascetics in ancient and medieval India, these descriptions in the texts of different traditions could not have arisen randomly and independently of one another. Let us recall that this clause was censored in Buddhist texts. It was unclear and indecent to the compilers and transmitters of these texts. Yet they could not remove it. They could only rationalize it. This indicates that the story has a long history and had already become canonical, meaning it could not simply be excluded from the tradition. Exactly how this typical narrative spread among the three traditions mentioned remains a matter of speculation. Brahmins, Buddhists, and Jains could have borrowed it from some fourth, more ancient source, or the Jains and Buddhists could have taken it from the Vedic tradition, or the Jains might have borrowed it from the Buddhists, who in turn took it from the Brahmins. These details will likely remain unresolved. Before continuing my reasoning, I should clarify that everything I say from this point onward is purely hypothetical. In other words, it is still impossible to discuss these matters with a high degree of certainty. It seems to me that the common elements between the Vedic story of Cyavana and the Buddhist episode about the Bodhisattva's asceticism are not limited to those of the episode with the villagers. To demonstrate this, I will briefly recount a more extended version of the story of Cyavana. The decrepit Cyavana lies motionless. Boys from the tribe or village of Śāryata mistreat him. In response, Cyavana curses the tribe. Kinsmen cease to recognize one another. The tribe's leader, Śāryata, seeks to appease the sage and arrives with his daughter Sukanya in a chariot, offering her in marriage to Cyavana. The curse is lifted and order is restored in the tribe. At Cyavana's request, Sukanya, his wife now, negotiates with the Ashwins to restore his youth. The Ashwins rejuvenate Cyavana by plunging him into a river or lake. The Ashwins rejuvenate Cyavana by plunging into a river or lake with him. In return, Ashwins regain their share of the sacrificial offering, which they had been denied. If we move beyond the story of village children tormenting the Bodhisattva in the Buddha's biography and consider Siddhārtha's journey toward enlightenment as a whole, several other interesting parallels emerge between the tale of Cyavana and the Buddhist narrative. The arrival of Śāryata, the tribal chief, to the rishi Cyavana recalls King Bimbisara's visit to the ascetic Bodhisattva. Like Śāryata, Bimbisara comes to the Bodhisattva in his chariot. He implores Siddhārtha to abandon his austerities, offering wealth and women in exchange. Yet the Bodhisattva remains steadfast. Before departing, the king secures a promise. When enlightenment is achieved, the awakened one will come to Bimbisara and impart his teachings. This parallel with the Vedic narrative may not be the most obvious one, and perhaps is even somewhat far-fetched. However, the fact that the episode with King Bimbisara in the Buddha's biography appears disconnected from the rest of the narrative, essentially standing as an isolated fragment, does raise certain suspicions here. The remaining parallels appear far more intriguing. They all revolve and they all revolve around the offering of milk rice porridge, odana, to the Bodhisattva. After consuming it, he abandoned his extreme asceticism and regained his physical strength and beauty. Sujata, the daughter of the village headman, who made this offering, plays a role in the Buddhist narrative strikingly similar to that of the Sukanya, daughter of the tribal chief Saryata. First, the names of these two maidens are quite similar, Sukanya and Sujata. Their resemblance extends beyond mere phonetic to their very meanings. Sukanya can be translated as the beautiful maiden, while Sujata means the noble maiden. Unlike Sukanya, Sujata does not marry the Bodhisattva. However, in the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, the maidens Nanda and Nandabala, who appear in that version of the story instead of Sujata, express their desire to become the Bodhisattva's wives, though he refuses them. As for Sujata, in certain versions of the Buddha's biography, she mistakes the Bodhisattva for a yaksha and makes offerings to him, hoping that it will help her to bear a son. Thus, while Sujata does not become the Bodhisattva's wife, the veneration she performs is nevertheless intended to bring her the blessing of a child. Just as Sukanya, having come to agreement with the Ashwins, helps Cyavana to regain his youth, so Sujata, having given the Bodhisattva Odana, helps him to restore the strength and beauty of his body. In some versions of the Buddha's biography, the acceptance of food from the Sujata is combined with bathing in the river. For example, in the Lalita Vistara, Siddhārtha first receives the bowl of Odana, then baths, and only after that he eats the Odana. This appears as a single continuous act. Moreover, both the bathing and the acceptance of food restore his strength and beauty. Similarly, immersion in a river or lake rejuvenates Cyavana. As you can see, the parallels between the Vedic and Buddhist accounts extend beyond the episode with the cowherd children, appearing in other episodes as well. As you can see, the parallels between the Vedic and Buddhist accounts extend beyond the episode with the cowherd children, appearing in other episodes as well, further evidence of their shared narrative roots. Now I would like to draw your attention to the article by Ricardo Ginevra, Myths of Non-Functioning Fertility Deities in Hittite and Core Indo-European. The author of the article analyzes and compares four myths: the Hittite myth of Telepinu, the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, the Norse myth of Balder, and the Indian myth of Cyavana. He arrives at the following conclusions. Quote, a series of phraseological and thematic parallels between the Hittite myth of Telepinu, the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, the Norse myth of Balder, and the Indic myths of Cyavana may be identified. These parallels match phraseological collocations and themes which are well attested independently in several Indo-European traditions. The use of these poetic devices is therefore a reflex of inherited Proto-Indo-European poetic culture. Even though the possibility of borrowing and aerial diffusion remains open, the most economical way to explain the numerous parallels between the Hittite, Greek, Norse, and Indic myths is to assume that they reflect an inherited Proto-Indo-European mythical theme about non-functioning fertility deities. End of quote. When speaking about the myth of a non-functioning fertility deity, Ginevra refers to the following narrative pattern. Due to some calamity or malicious act, the fertility deity loses its power and becomes inactive. This is often accompanied by the loss of youth, blindness, immobility, or similar afflictions. The land under this deity's dominion then falls into disarray. Subsequently, someone, typically arriving on horseback or by chariot, is dispatched to the deity. Through some means, he revives the deity, restoring order in the world. For illustration, I will quote the retelling of an Old Norse myth from Ginevra's article. I'll skip the other stories so as not to take too much time. Quote, pierced by a mistletoe twig thrown by his brother Hödr, the god Balder falls dead. The other gods are so shocked that they are not even able to lift him up. Baldur's death is associated with cosmic disorder, as it is explicitly stated to be the unluckiest deed that ever happened among gods and mortals. Baldur's mother, Frigg, sends the god Hermodr to bring Baldur back from Hell, the realm of the dead. He rides a horse to the place where Baldur is and fights him seated. All efforts to bring Baldur back from the dead fail for the moment. When cosmic order will be restored after the end of time, however, Baldur will come back and cornfields will grow without sowing. Unquote. The Bodhisattva is certainly not a fertility deity, nor for the matter is Cyavana. Yet, in my view, the Bodhisattva nevertheless demonstrates a certain connection to ancient fertility cults. One piece of evidence for this can be found in some versions of the above-mentioned Sujata's offering narrative. The Nidana Katha explicitly states why Sujata began preparing her offering of milk rice porridge. While praying at the Nigrodha tree, she had made a vow. Quote, "Now at that time at Uruvela, in the village Senani, there was a girl named Sujata born in the house of Senani the landowner, who, when she had grown up, made a vow at the Nigrodha tree, saying, 'If I am married into a family of equal rank and have a son for my firstborn child, then I will spend every year 100,000 on an offering to thee.'" Unquote. Her prayers bore fruit, and so she set about fulfilling her vow. In this context, the Bodhisattva appears as a kind of tree spirit or yaksha who granted Sujata offspring. We encounter something similar in an old Chinese translation of Lalita Vistara. It states, "By that time, the eldest daughter had married and wanted to give birth to a son. So she firmly decided to prepare the best treat and offer it to the spirit of the mountain and the tree." Unquote. This spirit of the mountain and the tree likely refers to a kind of genius loci, or yaksha. To these episodes, we can add as supplementary arguments the evident connection between the Bodhisattva and the Buddha with trees, as well as the widespread cult of yakshas among Shramana movements, including Jainism and Ajivikism. Still, the Bodhisattva's link to fertility cults undoubtedly requires deeper investigation, and any definitive claims about it would currently seem premature. Nevertheless, if Ginevra considers it plausible to compare the legend of Cyavana with other Indo-European narratives of non-functioning fertility deities, and if, on the other hand, the shared origin of the Cyavana story and the accounts of the Bodhisattva's torment are indeed evident, then it is entirely justified to include Siddhārtha's story within the broader framework of Indo-European myths examined by Ginevra. In other words, there is a strong likelihood that the episode involving the village children and the Bodhisattva has ancient Proto-Indo-European roots. In closing, I should clarify that I do not presume the story of the Bodhisattva's asceticism to be solely a fertility deity myth. Yet I am inclined to believe that such myth may have influenced the Buddha's biography and significantly reshaped its narrative. Thank you for your attention.
Are there any questions?
Thank you so much for this talk. I have one question. I wonder if in any of your readings you've ever encountered the idea of people mocking the Buddha or the ascetics as mad, or this idea of madness. Sometimes that has occurred in early Indian religious traditions. I think the Sanskrit word is usually unmataka or unmata.
Excuse me, making what? I'm not hearing you well.
Sorry?
Making what? I don't understand.
I wonder if in any of the readings that you've done of this story, if when people are mocking the Buddha or the ascetics and the other textual traditions, if ever the idea of madness comes up. Sometimes it comes up in Indian ascetic traditions like unmata or unmataka. Yeah.
Well, I have some interesting thought about the figure of piśāca, because piśāca is a kind of demon that can, by which a man can be possessed. And if a man is possessed by a piśāca, then people do some rituals to get it out of the man. These rituals actually, in some detail, are very similar to that story I was talking about, because they use a special kind of grass, which they throw into the man possessed by piśāca, trying to get piśāca out of this man. But I was not bold enough to include this material into my consideration, because it's not very safe, or not very, how it's called, supplied by arguments. Other accounts of madness I cannot recall actually in this text. It's only a hint to madness.
I just wanted to ask, it's very interesting, this research that you're doing. How did you become interested in this philological analysis? What sparked your interest?
Well, speaking about that very episode, actually my student who is sitting here, Margarita, was interested in me in this episode because she studies classical medieval Sanskrit comedies. And there is a typical character of ugly ascetic who is mocked by the characters of the play, for example, or is laughed at by the people who watch the play. And this ascetic, this ugly ascetic, is often compared to a piśāca. And I recollected in my mind that the very similar episodes I met in Buddhist texts. And Buddhist text is the text I study for a long time. Basically, I study Buddha's biographies. That's why. So these two stories united in my research. I'm planning to to compose an article dedicated to this very character of a ugly ascetic in comedies laughed by people, laughed at by people. Sorry, my English is not very perfect.